now either repeat their conclusions in multiple blog posts or disengage from the continuing stalemate. But I'm proposing a new direction for the conversation. I'll argue that a digitally gathered church is not one that's abandoned community in favor of a fragmented individualism, as some might accuse, but rather it's found an alternative cultural expression of its necessary gathering, one which not only values but relies upon participation, one which, in the words of Pete Ward, emerges out of the active ministry of everyone who is joined to Christ and which chooses to exist within a new place. I'll firstly consider how digital technologies have brought about a change in language use, exposing a new understanding of what it means to gather. I'll then explore the subtle consequences of integrating this discovery into our understanding of the church and reflect on whether it corresponds with ordinary theology. And finally, if I've got time, I'll propose some areas for further study. Rather than asking what some may consider the ecclesiological fundamental question of whether the online gathering of Christians may be considered church, I want to address the yet prior question of whether 2 or 3 online may even be considered to be gathered, and if so, what the consequences of that insight may be. As a proponent of digital church, I endorse the predominant objection of many digital detractors that the church must be axiomatically gathered. However, I propose that gathering need not be physical. Furthermore, I suggest that by extending our understanding of gathering thus, we unveil new insights into the unchanging nature of the church. Avery Dulles notes that, quote, "The images and forms of Christian life will continue to change as they have in previous centuries, but what is new in Christianity always grows out of the past and has its roots in scripture and tradition," end quote. Therefore, I want to start with the early Christian communities. As they began to form, they chose to refer to themselves as an ecclesia. Its primary meaning as a gathering is generally accepted. As Ward notes, we find it hard to imagine church where some form of congregational gathering is not at its centre. And so this became an underpinning concept for the self-understanding of the early church, which has persisted to the present day. They were a gathering. While one may be a Christian alone, it's not possible to be the church unless somehow gathered. In the digital age, though, our use of words such as meet and gather have changed. And I contend that this is neither neologism or metaphor, but reflects a development in our understanding of their underlying concept. Speaking of the first century church's nominative use of ecclesia, Ronald Giza properly asserts that this could only have been understood as a physical gathering since no other method was then possible, but also adds that this should not necessarily constrain us if our understanding of gathering changes as time and technology progress. And Andrew Greystone takes this further, making a similar point in relation to Jesus' promise that he'd be present where 2 or 3 gather in his name, stating that with a new understanding of gathering, it's now not at all clear whether gathering in his name depends on the actual clash of bodies in a physical place, or whether other sorts of gathering might do the same job. Linguistically, it would be correct to say that I chatted with someone over Zoom, in a mirror of the language that I might use in a telephone conversation. However, I'd be more likely instead to say that I'd met with them, my assertion no longer focusing on the action I undertook in conversing, but on the coming together, which enabled that conversation to take place. Arthur Bochner and Carolyn Ellis asked pertinently, can I be said to be with others when the place in which we experience ourselves as joined or together is a reality that consists only of information, a complex string of on and off switches? However, not only is the language of spaces integral to the internet, but also the feeling of occupying such spaces. And that applies beyond the realm of video telepresence and VR. And John MacArthur and Ashley Farley-White showed definitively that scheduled Twitter chats can also operate as third places, gathering spots. And this new notion of place that's emerged no longer requires those who gather to be co-located in either space or time. Gathering can be both ageographical and asynchronous. When gathering digitally, the decisive factor becomes community formation. As Mark Scanlon observes, relational life creates spaces in which religious practice can take place. We discover, therefore, that gathering is reliant upon the purposes of our interaction rather than on our spatio-temporal coordinates. We come together through factors such as our activity, intent, shared experiences, and mutual growth. These give us a shared identity, causing us to congregate, cohering us together and consolidating us into a community. Paul Fidus brought this into ecclesiological focus when he noted in the Baptist Times that as the 2020 lockdown ended, some Christians were willing to gather in a building while others preferred to gather at home using the internet. Not everyone is enthusiastic towards this digital gathering, seeing it as some lesser form of meeting, yet the development of the concept of gathering is generally acknowledged. Michael Beck and Rosario Picardo may echo Tim Hutchings' accusation that online churches retreat from the physical, and they both explicitly state that in a church setting there's no supplement for good old cell-swapping, molecule-exchanging, face-to-face flesh and blood community. But then just 2 sentences later in their book, they nonetheless admit that online is also a place where real people gather and where real church can be formed. As an example, we can now gather in prayer without co-locating, and I experienced this myself recently across a closed Facebook group where news was shared of a colleague fighting for his life. Interacting across space and time, hundreds of us came together, uniting in intercession in the now familiar experience of a comment stream of prayer. This evidence is what Geoffrey Mahn affirms, that new forms of media can make possible new ways of thinking and new ways of relating. And so I concur with both Heidi Campbell and Stephen Garner, who assert that online technologies have created new ways of gathering. This isn't a fundamental change to the notion of gathering, however, but rather digitality prophetically uncovering something which has always been the case, but was previously hidden. The church understands itself by metaphor. Ecclesia remains perhaps the most prominent amongst ordinary Christians. Paul Minier states that the first century way of thinking was dominated by pictures, analogies, and images, and so it was natural that the church's self-understanding came through the use of what are now commonly termed models. Indeed, he enumerates 96 of varying significance in the New Testament alone, with even more continuing to be proposed, because as Paul VI observed, the church is a mystery and so remains ever new, ever open to new and deeper explorations. And Avery Dulles suggests that we may assess these models by living out the consequences to which they point, whereby asking whether they yield good fruit or bad, whether they lead to new insights, even whether they can rehabilitate and legitimize intuitions that were hitherto theologically problematic. Accordingly, if we're to accept an enhanced interpretation of gathering and incorporate this into our ecclesiology, we need to examine its consequences, considering whether these align with both ordinary theology and with the insights found within other ecclesiological models. One of the simplest consequences of digital gathering is that the ecclesia becomes legitimately permanent. If gathering must remain physical, then the ecclesia would cease to be each time a worship service ends and the congregation scatters. And additionally, the promise of Matthew 18 and 20, that we can be assured of Christ's presence amongst us, becomes an almost comical to and fro of existence as individuals, Christians, meet and separate. And this logical consequence seems at odds with ordinary theology, yet, as Dulles notes, congregational ecologies do make the church to be transitory, coming in and out of being according to the activity of individuals. But that conclusion is utterly alien, I suggest, to the average Christian. In 1999, a prayer movement started in the UK, quickly growing into a plan for a continuous relay of prayer. By 2001, thousands had committed to a year-long vigil of non-stop prayer. However, this is not something new. The Akoimatoi of Constantinople and the monks of Saint Maurice d'Agon were both known for what is now referred to as the liturgy of Laus Perennis, literally constant praise, where the monks were divided into squadrons which took turns in order that they might fulfill a monastic round of 24 offices to fill every hour of the day. There's clearly something attractive about the notion of church in perpetual prayer, permanently existing. These examples can be seen as attempts to bring that desire into reality in the flesh and blood world of the church militant. Incorporating the insights that digitality offers to our understanding of gathering into our ecclesiology both brings this desire into reality while simultaneously drawing formal and ordinary theologies into accord. The church is in perpetual existence, and I am perpetually linked with it. Applying a similar logic to geographical reach, we find that the ecclesia correspondingly extends its physical scope. Heidi Campbell notes that to refer to the church as a gathered body used to imply a specific spatial location on definable boundaries. There are places where the church was and places where it was not. When the physically gathered moment ends, individual Christians spread far and wide, and they may do great good where they go, but as the church scatters, it ceases to be, no longer a united body, but disparate cells. And once again, that contradicts ordinary theology. The cartoon where the church is, that's on the screen, captures that viewpoint, shows a busy city scene with individuals going about their daily business, with captions pointing to some of them indicating here. This is where the church is, wherever presumably a Christian person is, whether they're sitting on the bus, whether they're at home, or up a ladder cleaning windows. The church consisting in small, discrete parts, yet remaining one. The church is not confined by accidents of interaction or co-location, but rather, as Matthew 13:13 indicates, it's hidden throughout the flower. And we can see a similar expression of the boundlessness of the church in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. The senior demon there describes the church as spread out through all time and space, yet quite invisible to these humans. This is a vision of a church not limited by geography, but pervading every corner of the world, unrestrained by the restrictions of where Christians physically meet. However, it's also invisible, hidden behind the physicality the humans suppose the church to be. As John Dyer notes, the real church is not gathered by sharing the same physical space and standing under the same roof, but by uniting under the name of Jesus. The perceptibility of the phenomenal church is now exposed, excuse me. The perceptibility of the phenomenal church is now exposed as simply a distracting blind which obscures the hidden reality. The new understanding of gathering allows that as physically gathered activities end, the church no longer dissipates and ceases to be. Instead, it disperses, diffusing itself into the wider community as leaven is spread throughout the dough. Excuse me. If we combine these first two consequences, that we can be united across both time and space, we find that Christians need never consider themselves separated from the church or apart from its fellowship. That's a concern for those who insist that gatherings must be physical and who cannot attend those gatherings. When discussing digital aliens, Philip Meadows refutes claims that gathering need be in the long tradition of physically embodied and geographically local communities of face-to-face fellowship. Utilizing deficiencies in physical gatherings, which nonetheless do not negate their validity as church, he appeals through similarity that the deficiencies of virtual church can be likewise overlooked. But I suggest that this can also be dealt with by remodeling our understanding of gathering through digital insight. Our expanded view enables us to consider ecclesia as ensuing when its members align in affection and identity. Thus, we gain accord with ordinary theology without needing to use Meadows' argument. Moreover, it better aligns with the model of church as a mystical communion, specifically as a community of persons, each of whom is individually free. And Howard Key, Howard Key allows us to go further still and to conjoin separate congregations by noting in his reflection on 1 Corinthians 1 verses 10-17 that the boundaries of allegiance to individual leaders, which we might perhaps consider as analogous to contemporary denominational distinctions, do not disunite. Thus, through the possibility of ageographical asynchronous gathering, each Christian is unified under a single existence as one ecclesia, jointly the people of God. And lastly, I suggest that digitality enables us to consider ourselves gathered in ministry. Consider this situation. A young man struggling to make ends meet arrives at the door of a church building seeking some food. Mrs. Brown, a kind lady within, hands over some provisions from a well-stocked cupboard. This isn't an extreme situation, and it's a common occurrence and has a simple common explanation. The church has done what Christ would have done by meeting someone's need. However, the ecclesia would seem to be absent. If physical gathering is a necessary prerequisite for the church to exist, then the church cannot have engaged with this help seeker because there was no church. Merely an interaction that took place within the same building that the church occupies on Sunday. They may have stocked the cupboard, yet that was help to Mrs. Brown in her philanthropy, not to the young man. His help was from her, not the church. Now that may seem quite pedantic, but yet again, it's a logical consequence of the requirement for a physical gathering. But I'd suggest that the view shared by both the man and Mrs. Brown would be that the church had helped him. Ordinary theology, therefore, suggests that there is some way in which the ecclesia was in evidence. And whilst it likely wouldn't have mattered to the man how he was helped, when asked, he would have credited the church as helping him, not Mrs. Brown. The expanded notion of gathering disclosed by digitality, however, which allows for gathering to occur through intent, enables us to see this simple deed by one individual as an act of service by the church, not as one done on their behalf. This notion of the ecclesia acting through one person is redolent of the priestly Eucharistic act, where, where, in the words of Ratzinger, the entire living church acts through the priest. We can see the same thing in the well-known prayer, Christ has no body, attributed to St. Teresa of Avila. Which combines this with the Pauline image of the church as the body of Christ. Mrs. Brown can therefore know that though she may stand by herself in a building, she's not alone in her service. As she stretches out her hand, she's not only stretching out the hand of Christ, but also the hand of every Christian who in that moment and that place, from their various moments and various places, unites with her in her ministry. This is the priesthood of all believers in action, which asserts that while the ministerial priest may preside, it's the royal priesthood of all the faithful that enacts. Though alone, she offers the hand of the whole church, not vicariously, but in reality. And just very quickly to note a couple of areas for further work. From these insights, I think fresh questions present themselves. Does gathering across time and space yield new insights into the nature of eternity? May that be considered a place. Does gathering at will yield new insights around the interrelationships of the three persons of the Godhead, in particular their perpetual fellowship during the time of the Son's incarnation, and subsequently when the Spirit was sent into the world? Does gathering in ministry grant insight into the missional activity of God and how within the actions of one all act? And can this generate insights into the essential paradox of threeness in oneness? Such questions are beyond the scope of today, but merit further research. However, I think two areas of study are worthy of particular note. Firstly, to explore the overlap between the notion of gathering I've used here with the Pacifica notion of a var, the concept of a connecting rather than a separating space between individuals as the prospect of capturing something of how gathering functions. And secondly, to explore the impacts of the consequences I've highlighted upon wider theological thought. Where I've referred to ecclesiological models above, they've been such that an understanding of the source domain might lead to a greater understanding of the church. However, led by Zizoulas and Wolff, the social Trinitarian model proposes an image of the church which operates in the opposite fashion, such that new insights about the church reveal something of the target domain of the Trinity. So in conclusion, proponents of online church may be tempted to say, along with the 16th century reformers, Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda, the church now reformed must always be reforming in its defense. However, whilst representing an innovation in church praxis, I suggest that online church requires neither a reformation in theology nor in ecclesiology, Far from it. For instead, digitality throws a new light upon our ecclesiology, revealing what has always been, yet hitherto was hidden. Thank you.